Hello YouTube! Before I forget, I want to wish everybody a very Merry Christmas. At the end of this video there's a little Christmas giveaway for an Imperial Knowledge lore book that I wrote myself, so if you want that, stay tuned until the end of the video. And I wish to welcome everyone to the first lore lecture on the First Era. The lore lectures are a series of lectures where I try to cover the entire history of the Elder Scrolls universe in a series of long lore lectures which are live recorded. This lecture was recorded a while ago with a live audience of Patreon supporters, and what you're about to listen to is a live recording from at that time. So if there's any mistakes in my pronunciation or anything, I haven't really edited it because it was a live recording for the people that were present. Unfortunately, due to low registries, I wasn't able to do a second reading of this lecture, so if any patrons who are watching this who have missed the first lecture, well, don't forget to check the Patreon page or Patreon Discord group in the future, because that's where I post the links to these things. So yeah, don't put that on mute. That said, if you want to be present at a live recording sometime, check out my Patreon page, but for now, let's roll the tape. Alright, good evening everybody, welcome back to the new lecture. It's been a while, last lecture was a few months ago, but in the meantime I've basically been gone and I haven't really had time to work on them. But now the entirety of the First Era outline is done, meaning that we can finally resume the lore lectures, more like a new sort of semester that we're doing. Now before we begin, I reckon that everybody here present knows the rules. I mean, keep your microphone muted during the lecture. In the middle of it we will have a 10-minute break, or maybe shorter if it's shorter. In that break we can answer some questions that you guys might have, fill your drinks, go to the toilet, etc. those kind of things. Important questions asked here live on the lecture by the patrons attending will be recorded and then added to the YouTube upload, if you consent to that, of course. I mean, if you don't want your voice online, then I won't add it into the lecture, or I might do a written question if that's a really important question. I do need to ask you to only ask very important and short questions during the break. That way we can move on quickly with the lecture, since some of our attendees are on a tight schedule. I just heard that they aren't, but still, for the sake of continuity of this lecture, please only ask your important questions in the break, or really short questions, so we can have the more important ones, or the longer ones or the less important ones at the end, since at the end is basically a general Q&A. So, for the people watching this on YouTube, the lectures break will be cut out for you, and the questions present in the recording will be gathered from all the readings that I did. This is the first reading. It might be that I use the second reading for YouTube upload, but we'll see that later. I apologize if my microphone quality differs per question answered at the end of this lecture, because that will be because it might be a different reading that I upload. Naturally, for the lecture itself I will of course use the best recording, so you'll be listening to the best one. That said, I assume that everybody that's present here right now watched or was present at the previous 3 lectures on the Dawn Era and the Meredith Era, as a lot of the information present in those lectures will not be repeated here, of course. To quickly recap, in the lecture on the Dawn Era we took a look at creation and the precursor races, and the precursor races' first known actions on Nirn, such as the Elnofey War, which ended up splitting the groups. After that we looked at how groups of Elnofey got isolated and developed themselves separately on the different continents on Nirn. And we then saw during the Meredith Era lectures how these groups ended up migrating to Tamriel. First the elves, who claimed dominance over the continent, and then the humans came after them from Edmora, who would slowly start to take dominance from the elves, resulting in the end of the Meredith Era, or more literally, end of the era of elvish dominance. Now, something interesting which slipped my attention in the earlier lectures is the fact that before any race of elves migrated to Tamriel, there already actually was a human race present on Tamriel. You might already know this if you watched my video on Stillrise Village, but this came actually as a surprise to me, and it's just a very embarrassing thing that I didn't mention it before, because among the beast races in the south there already lived a race of humans on Tamriel. These humans were called the Kothringi, and these are most likely the descendants of the wandering Elnofey who got isolated on Tamriel and ended up evolving into that human race known as the Kothringi. These humans are very different from the humans from Atmora, and of course from the humans from Yokuda, who also differ from Atmora since they've been isolated for such a long time. They are humans with a metallic-like skin, which, at least in lore, seems to be a bit mirroring. Now in ESO we can actually encounter some of these Kothringi, but there it's more metallic and isn't really like mirror-like skin. Sorry. These Kothringi were very tribal and were notoriously underdeveloped compared to their cousins on Atmora and Yokuda. Atmora and Yokuda had massive cities and had already progressed in technology, Yokuda even more than Atmora, as we will see later in this lecture. But the Kothringi still lived in small camps and small nomadic societies. Therefore, their actions have only had a very small impact on this large scale of things, as they got basically overshadowed in history on southern Tamriel by the already existing Khajiit kingdoms and elsewhere, which were quite advanced, and the Zenmir society in Black Marsh, which was also very advanced. Well, these humans have most likely been on Tamriel since the Elnofey Wars, since they were isolated wandering Elnofey. Their little bit of impact in their society, the little bit of impact their society had on history was during the reign of the Riemann Empire near the end of the First Era, which we will touch on in the next lectures. So, this little bit of recap and additional information that I forgot to mention out of the way, what are we gonna do? Or better said, what am I gonna do, since you guys are mostly just gonna listen. In the upcoming lectures, I will be taking a look at the First Era in a loosely structured way. Since this is not a regular lore video, and I'm looking at history on a, pretty massive scale, I cannot go into much detail in a lot of the cases and a lot of the specific events. And with every era that we progress, more and more information becomes available, as in the First Era we already have a lot of information, but especially in the Third Era there is just so much information that I will have to cut back even more drastically than I have to do now. Where, for example, during the Dawn Era every scrap of information was relevant, now we have so much information that I need to start cutting back on the things that we're going to talk about, and the things that we do talk about, we'll usually talk about pretty briefly. So, in the end I decided that we will talk about the First Era systematically by talking about what I would say are three distinctive periods. Today we're going to be talking about the period leading up to the Enslave Rebellion. This is essentially a time in which elves are still largely dominating Tamriel. In the next lecture we will then be talking about the period of the Alessian Empire, from the rebellion that founded it to its eventual dissolution. Then in the final and third lecture we will be talking about the Interregnum, an eventual foundation of the Riemann Empire, which ended on the year 2920 of the First Era, which is its last year, which was eventually marked by the assassination of Riemann Cyril III. So, this means that today we are actually going to look at the shortest period of these lectures, roughly 242 years of history, meaning that we have a little more time to spend talking about specific events. So, the First Era. It began when King Eplior, a Bosmer Camoran king, which was basically... So, the First Era began when the Bosmer king Eplior Cameron of the aristocratic Cameron family had loosely reunited all of Valenwood under his rule and proclaimed that this would be a new era for the Bosmer and even for all of Tamriel. This would be the year 1 of the First Era. Most likely he would have said something like, "This is the new era in which the Bosmer are united." And because before that time just wasn't being centrally recorded, it was generally accepted by everyone around Tamriel for some reason that this was a new era, and this new era of Eplior was eventually accepted by all of Tamriel, as his year count has henceforth been used by all of Tamriel's citizens, as eventually everybody would start calling it the First Era. And of course in the Second Era people would still refer to it as the First Era, with Eplior's founding of the First Era, or at least start of the First Era, still marked as the beginning of the First Era. The fact that Eplior Cameron managed to unite all of the Bosmer is impressive, but This is most likely taken a little bit out of character, as this conquest of his was most likely just a conquest of the few larger Bosmer cities that existed at the time. I mean, the Bosmer had a few cities already, most prominently being the great city of Eldenroot, which would later on become the center of the Camoran dynasty's rule. While Yplir was formerly king of Valenwood, I personally doubt that he had a lot of control over the largest part of Bosmer society, which was still nomadic and very tribal, living in the jungles. And to this day, these people in the tribal, in the jungle parts of Valenwood who live a tribal lifestyle, they still don't answer to any king or ruler, as they are being led by their local spiritual leaders. But we can't be sure about that, as we simply don't have information from the time of Yplir Cameron. Yplir Cameron's loose grip on the entirety of Valenwood is in stark contrast to the Ayleid Empire in Cyrodiil, which was not being centrally ruled at this time, but existed out of several smaller Ayleid kingdoms who were loosely bound in a sort of union. Their empire was largely based in Cyrodiil and the surrounding areas of the other provinces, with smaller kingdoms being spread into Elsewhere, Valenwood, Black Marsh, and even a few far-out conclaves in High Rock. The Ayleid Empire was very much reliant on slavery, with most of the slaves being composed out of races that the Ayleids deemed lower, like for example the beast races of Tamriel and the humans. It is said that there once lived an intelligent beast-like race in Cyrodiil, which were not Argonians or Khajiit, but were humanoid-like birds who were intelligent. But this race has never been seen in any of the games, and the documentation on them has been very bad, because they seem to have been disappeared from history. At this point, most people agree that these humanoid bird sort of creatures have basically been eradicated by the Ayleids for being enslaved. The Ayleids just enslaved them all and they eventually died off. At least that's the leading theory. There might be something else behind it, as we don't have any concrete sources from this time. But most scholars agree on that they were probably being eradicated by the Ayleids. During the Moravic era, the Ayleids had built a large-scale empire, with its center being the Temple of the Ancestors. This Temple of the Ancestors, we don't exactly know the city's name which was built around it, but this city-state with the White Gold Tower, or the Temple of the Ancestors, at its center, is essentially what would later become the Imperial city and was the center of the Ayleid Empire. We do not know an awful lot about how their empire was structured, but since the collective kingdoms were together regarded as the Ayleid Empire, we are to presume that there was some sort of union between the kingdoms. Most likely there would have been a sort of council between the different kingdoms, which was ruled by a sort of high king. We know that at least at some points in history the Ayleids had high kings or kings ruling over the entire empire. For example, Umaril the Unfeathered, which we can fight in Oblivion when he returns to Tamriel, was such a sort of high king. But again, we don't know if that was always the case. Maybe there were periods without a high king or central king, where the different kingdoms just loosely work together. We don't know exactly how this is, but it's pretty fascinating to think about, because the Ayleid Empire was very fragmented, and the many different kingdoms often quarreled with each other, and there were a lot of disputes, especially over religion. This big split and fragmentation had started back in the ending years of the Moravic era, when the Ayleid kingdoms began to embrace Daedric worship over the worship of the Aedra. The Ayleids would often use pacts with the Daedra to summon armies of Daedra, which they used to then conquer more land and keep their slaves in check. Most of the Ayleid kingdoms made no distinction between Daedra and worship, meaning that often considered bad Daedra, like Molech Baal and Maroon's Dagon, received as much legal worship as often considered good Daedra, like Meridia. This worked out pretty well for the Ayleid kingdoms, as it garnered them immense amounts of power. But it also had some severe drawbacks, as it completely fragmented the Ayleid Empire. Because, you see, when their culture before the embrace of Daedra worship has been... Where their culture before the embrace of Daedra worship had been largely homogeneous, now religion has become a large cleavage in their empire, as each kingdom had different Daedra that they worshipped, and different norms and values corresponding with them. This resulted in Daedric cults getting a lot of institutional power within the different kingdoms, resulting in much tension between the different cults in the different kingdoms. For example, kingdoms largely ruled by cults of more like Baal would usually be bickering and backstabbing kingdoms ruled by cults, for example, venerating Meridia. One of the best examples of these tensions is the conflict known as the Narfandel Schism. This was an event taking place roughly 50 years before the Saint Alessia would come into the picture, in which several Daedric cults still ruled the Ayleid Empire, or at least some kingdoms across the Ayleid Empire, and where Daedric cults warred with Ayleids who still worshipped exclusively Aedra and basically drove them out of Cyrodiil. These kind of tensions greatly weakened the institutional strength of the Ayleid Empire, making the empire even more vulnerable, even though their geopolitical power had increased due to the armies of Daedra. This period, under the rule of Daedric cults, was quite strange, as slowly but steadily, their society would spiral completely out of control. It would not take long before nearly all the work in the empire was no longer done by Ayleids, but it was all done by slaves, while the Ayleids themselves would start to develop really strange and a bit of perverse habits, like turning torture into an art of some sort in the more degenerative kingdoms. Slaves would be used for all kinds of weird entertainment in torturous acts, some of which Ayleids would even use hallucinogenic drugs while torturing their subjects. Human children would also often be used for these kind of things. For example, there was a really infamous sport called tiger sport, in which human children would be forcibly ingested with drugs and then chased by tigers. During this period, historians say that the rules of the empire became During this period, historians say that the rulers of the empire became ever more arrogant and oppressing to the other races within their kingdom, which would eventually lead to the large-scale uprising now known as the Enslave Rebellion, in which Saint Alessia would heed the needs in an uprising against their Ayleid masters. It is said that the ex-human slaves, who would later found the First Empire with Saint Alessia, worshipped the Aedra almost exclusively, because they copied the religion of their slave masters before they started worshipping the Daedra. Because the humans refused to go along with the Daedra worship that would come in the later periods of the Ayleid Empire, as this worship had increased the cruelty against the slaves by their masters, causing for the humans to only worship the Aedra and despise their masters for worshipping the Daedra, because that only had made their situation significantly worse. But while the humans in Cyrodiil were being oppressed, humans in Skyrim had already largely driven out the former Snow Elf population by the end of the Moredic era, and they had founded one of the first human civilizations under Ysgramor, at least the first human civilization on Tamriel. And this civilization would be ruled by his bloodline until the year 369 of the First Era. As we talked about last lecture, this civilization had significant domestic civil conflict in the late Moredic era, also known as the Dragon War. This war was fought between dragons and those humans who worshipped them, versus the humans that wanted to rid their society of the oppressive dragon cult. This war had made it so that the human civilization on Skyrim was long occupied with domestic infighting, some of which apparently only ended very close to the beginning of the First Era. This civilization was a loose collection of holds reigned by Jarls. It was most likely composed of Eastmarch, the Rift, Winterhold and the Pale, or as they are called in Skyrim the game, the Old Hold, which were the so-called original holds of Skyrim. It was only in the year 143 of the First Era when a descendant of Ysgramor, Harold, managed to unite these holds in one big kingdom, or the Kingdom of Skyrim. He became the first ever king of Skyrim, but before that point, the Jarls of Skyrim still considered themselves to be part of the old Admoran society. But as the situation on Admora had worsened and a new leader appeared to lead them, Harold, the holds of Skyrim transformed themselves into the Kingdom of Skyrim, under his lead. Over the years of Harold's reign, the Kingdom of Skyrim assimilated the newer holds, Hafingar, Hjalmarch, Whiterun and Falkreath, into the fray, and by the time of Harold's death, all of Skyrim was loosely united under the banner of a High King. During this period, Harold also managed to destroy the last remaining remnants of the dragon cult, who had been hiding in a small monastery somewhere in the Rift. The descendants of Ysgramor and Harold would continue to rule the Kingdom of Skyrim for several more centuries, but that's something that we will see in addition to the processes in the other provinces after the break. I'll see you all in a couple of minutes. After 18 minutes of this lecture, there's time for a break. So yeah, I'm gonna stop my recording and If any of you have any questions, ask them in a minute. Alright, so after the death of High King Harold of Skyrim, Skyrim would be ruled by his and Ysgrimmor's descendants for several more centuries. During the rule of the descendants, most notably under High King Vrag and High King Galir, the Kingdom of Skyrim would conquer multiple of the surrounding territories and other provinces. This began with the conquest of the Reach in the east after the Nords had discovered a proto-elvish human race there, now known as the Bosmer, which were half elf and half human. The Nords then decided to wage war against them because the Nords then decided to invade the Reach because they wanted to free these half-humans from the oppression of the elves that apparently ruled them. This conquest of the Reach went very well, and then this military success instigated a series of conquests on Tamriel, causing the Nords to conquer most of High Rock, mainland Morrowind, and large portions of northeastern Cyrodiil, also called the Nibelheim Valley. You see, the interesting thing about these conquests is that they came in what essentially was a sort of chain reaction. You see, the biggest benefactors of the conquest in the Reach and High Rock were the Jarls of the Eastern Holds. They gained massive amounts of lands and new riches to exploit. This caused then the Jarls of the Western Holds to also crave more land to keep up with their eastern neighbors. After which Morrowind was then invaded to keep them happy, which then in turn led to the Jarls of the South saying, yo, we want land too, and then they discovered there was no land for them to conquer since the Jarl Mountains are pretty much worthless, which led to the High King of Skyrim to then conquer large parts of Nibelheim for them. This chain reaction of sorts, of just trying to keep the different Jarls happy, led to an extremely rapid expansion of the Kingdom of Skyrim, which eventually became the Northern Human Empire, which earned this Nordic Empire the name of First Empire of Man. This First Empire of Man then drove out or subjected the population of the conquered provinces of Morrowind and High Rock, both of which has significant elven civilizations on them, but a lack of elvish unity in both provinces made them easy to conquer. For example, in High Rock there was a society of elven city-states, which had some humans in it, the Bretons, who played second-class citizens there, and often interbred with the elves. This long interbreeding led to the eventual creations of the Breton as a race, who lived in peaceful coexistence with the elves living in High Rock. They were second-class citizens, yes, but they were not subjected to torture or slavery, and in general they had rights and they were respected. Life for humans wasn't all that bad in High Rock in comparison to the other real human populations living under elven rule. However, High Rock was far from united when the Nords attacked, and it was fragmented into several city-states who sort of refused to help each other, which made it easier for the Nords to take over High Rock completely and incorporate it into the Empire. The conquest of Morrowind by the Nords was also made pretty easy due to internal strife in the province. This was because Morrowind was inhabited by both Dwemer and Chimer, who at this time constantly warred with each other and among each other. There were a lot of internal conflicts in both societies of the Dwemer and the society of the Chimer, and in addition to that, both were basically unwilling to cooperate against the invading Nords with the other. This lack of unity between the Chimer and the Dwemer then gave the Nords the opening that they needed to take over most of mainland Morrowind, only stopping at the border of Black Marsh. Part of the reason that the Chimer and the Dwemer were so shatteringly defeated was because the Nords were using the Thu'um against the Dwemer and the Chimer armies. This is the power of the voice that the Dragonborn can use in Skyrim, as most of you probably know. While the Nords managed to conquer mainland Morrowind, the island of Vardenfell stayed out of their reach, as on the island the Dwemer clans had managed to unite, making a Nordic landing on the island virtually impossible. Later in the First Era, Nordic occupation of the mainland led to the Dwemer and the Chimer uniting in the alliance of the First Council. This was establishing a common state of Resdayn that would resist the Nords, but that will be featured in the next lecture. So the next thing that we will be talking about is Black Marsh, as around the first 300 years or so of the First Era, the great Zen-Mir society that the Argonians had in the early Moredic era had already completely disappeared. Many of its step pyramids still existed, but mostly the Argonians had simply gone back to a tribal way of life. This had made it so that during this period, just like the Kothringi humans in Black Marsh, the Argonians contributed little to the history of Tamriel. The only thing of note that was happening during this period were the foundation of the cities of Stormhold and Gideon, which were not founded by Argonians, because they were living a tribal life, but were founded by Aelid renegades, who fled the chaotic Cyrodiil. These were mostly the Aelid renegades who still worshipped the Aedra and were driven out by other Daedra worshipping kingdoms. Most of these renegades... While most of the elvish races were busy infighting among each other and the humans were on the rise during the First Era, there was one race living in relative harmony and peace: the Khajiit. The province of Elsewhere during the first couple of centuries of the First Era was split into 16 different kingdoms. In lore discussions on Elsewhere, this period is often referred to as the 16 Kingdoms period. During this period, the Khajiit managed to coexist in, relative harmony, as each kingdom had their own role in society. They had their own imports, exports, and goods and services that it could provide. This caused for a very complex, but also very integrated economy around Elsewhere, as for example the kingdom of Anaquina would provide trained warriors to the kingdom of Torval, which would then provide Anaquina with goods from the sea. It is said that during this period, the power and influence over Elsewhere and who would It is said that during this period, the power and influence over Elsewhere cycled through the kingdoms based on the phases of the moon. For example, when both moons were full, Anaquina would have the dominant power over the region, while when there were 2 new moons, the kingdom of Sensual would have the dominant power over Elsewhere, and so on. Every phases of the moon had another kingdom ruling over Elsewhere. So the entire region. This system of shifting authority and integrated economy actually worked wonders for the Khajiit, as during the 16 Kingdoms period, they prospered and stood very strong against any invaders, causing for Elsewhere not to fall under any foreign power for the majority of the First Era. The Summerset Isles were in a similar situation. The Isles were united under an Altmer government, which had strong isolationist policies, choosing not to intervene or have heavy contact with any of the civilizations on Tamriel. In the meantime, their civilization prospered as they made the islands their own. Other than small disputes, their society was actually quite peaceful, and when war came into the picture, it would usually be war against the Slode or the Marmer, which attempted repeatedly to invade the Isles. For the Marmer's part, this was mostly because they invaded under their immortal king Orgnum, who sought revenge against the Altmer for being descendants of those who banished them from Altmuris in the early Merethic era. The Marmers sought to conquer the Summerset Isles, which seemed to be a sort of great national desire on the continent of Piendernay. This continent is, as we know, a mixture of swamps and jungles, on which the Marmer had started the civilization after their banishment from the Isles. But how exactly they were faring on Piendernay in the early First Era, or most of history actually, is completely unknown, as no records of their civilization on their homeland have reached Tamriel. The only true records that we have of the Marmer are those of their interactions with Tamriel. Akavir is in largely the same situation, as we simply don't know what's going on the continent. Akavir specifically is one large blank, even bigger than Piendernay. During the Merethic and early First Era, there's literally no contact between Akavir and Tamriel, causing for a complete absence of historical records on our side, so I really can't say anything more about them. The only 2 continents that we know something about during this period are Yokuda and Atmora. In the case of Atmora, we know that during the early First Era, the true downfall of the continent had already begun, as in the year 68 of the First Era, the final wave of migration to Tamriel came, which were just some ships which were mainly filled with corpses. This signaled that the continent had already begun to cool down and no longer able to... The fact that the final wave of migration to Tamriel in the year 68 from Atmora was just 2 ships filled completely with corpses signals that this continent had already begun to cool down, no longer being able to sustain life, and the few people that were left at Atmora at this time made desperate attempts to reach Tamriel and find a viable life, but at least we know that the final migration wave failed in that regard. So we know that the story of Atmora has largely ended at the year 68 of the First Era, as most of the population has probably been eradicated at this point. At least we have no further records of their civilization on there. Yokuda, on the other hand, was still thriving at this time. After the extinction of the left-handed elves, Yokuda had become united under one large Yokudan empire. This empire was completely ruled by the Yokudans, who were the precursors of the Red Guards. Their empire was led by an emperor, and it was actually extremely advanced for its time. They made great innovations in many fields such as astrology, agriculture, magic, philosophy and shipbuilding. A very interesting invention they did was creating a type of stone which would completely disintegrate when an earthquake hit, just completely disintegrate into dust. They used this type of stone for things like roofs, so that when an earthquake hit, the stones from the roof could not kill the Red Guards who were resting under the roof. So that when an earthquake hit, the stones from the roof could not kill the Red Guards in the house. It might not be the most practical invention, but it would definitely be something interesting, and it's a clear diversion from most things that were invented on the mainland. If you still don't get what I mean with the disintegrating stone, imagine that your roof during an earthquake, instead of just falling down upon your head, it just completely goes up in dust, so it can't hurt you. That's basically the idea of the stone. The Yokudan Empire was able to greatly expand due to partly their increased technology and a surplus of food derived from their agricultural advances. Some of this knowledge would later help the Red Guard survive in the dry landscape of Hammerfell, but unfortunately a lot of their ancient knowledge has been lost to the ages since the migration of Tamriel in the First Era. But that's something that we will see in the next lecture when we see the Red Guards finally reaching Tamriel. Well, first as the Yokudans and then as the Red Guards. For Akavir though, something that I forgot to mention is that there was one thing that we know of Akavir during this time, or at least what we think to know of Akavir during this time. It's the fact that pirates with strange features have been spotted on Tamriel's eastern coast during the early First Era. Those are mostly linked by most people to Akavir, but we do not know if these pirates actually came from Akavir or the islands between Tamriel and Akavir, so the islands of Katnoke, Inslia, and I don't really remember what the third one was from the top of my head, I'm sorry. Now, a race that we haven't talked about yet in these lectures are the Orcs. Their race came to be after the followers of Malakath were transformed into the Orcs by the Daedric Prince Boethia. This transformation was most likely taking place around the first couple of years of the First Era, as the first sightings of Orcs were in the first couple of years of the First Era in the Iliac Bay region. The Orcs slowly spread to the north of Tamriel, usually being shunned by the other races for their appearance. They lived in small tribal communities with their own chieftains, and their society had little impact on history. At this point at least. Their true impact we will see in the next lecture, when the first ever Orsinium or Orc town is founded in High Rock, as a sort of capital of Orcish civilization, which was long after the fall of the Aeliad Empire and Nordic Empire, who we have seen dominating Tamriel in today's lecture. Next time we'll see how the Aeliad Empire quickly disintegrates when Saint Alessia starts her rebellion, and how she subsequently founds the first Cyrodiilic human empire, the Alessian Empire. We will also see how the Nordic Empire will quickly disintegrate, as when Ysgramor's dynasty comes to an end, the Moot of Jarls completely fails to appoint a new king. And after that we will also see finally the final migrations to Tamriel, the migrations from Yokuda, as the continent will sink largely into the sea, causing the desperate population to flee to Tamriel just as their cousins from Edmora and the elves from Altmuris did several centuries ago. And that was a quick overview of the situation in the first roughly 3 centuries of the First Era. I sometimes ventured a little bit beyond the Alessian Rebellion to complete the stories that I tell, so that I don't say too often, yo, we'll see that next lecture, especially since it's just the tail end of a story. But I hope that I did an okay job in covering the first segment of the First Era, the period leading up to the Alessian Rebellion. For those people who joined 5 minutes after the start of the lecture, I've decided to do the First Era in 3 parts. First, the part leading up to the Alessian Rebellion, then the Alessian Rebellion and Alessian Empire, and then finally the Interregnum and the Riemann Empire, as those I see as 3 distinctive periods in the First Era. So, thank you all very much for your enduring attention. I really appreciate everyone who showed up, and I hope that everybody here enjoyed the lecture. I will open up the registration for the second reading of this lecture to patrons who could not make it immediately for this lecture. So yeah, that way we can hopefully quickly move on to the First Era Part 2. But first I need to do the second reading of this lecture. I will let the people that joined later this time know when the second reading is. You can also register for it, of course, so that you can still get the first couple of minutes from this lecture if you were late. Thank you all very much again for your attention. I'm sorry for my stuttering sometimes. For some reason I've had a real big trouble with scripts as of late, also with my normal videos, where I'll sometimes need to record sentences 3 times over. So I'm really sorry for that if it was a problem. So now I'm gonna shut down my recording software, and if there's any questions, let me know after I switch recording software. The good questions will of course make it into the YouTube upload, provided that you consent to having them put in. Shutting down the software now. So this is the end of the video. If you ever wish to be present at one of these lore lectures, so be present live while I'm recording it, you have to check out my Patreon page. Basically every reward tier can come from $1 to 15, doesn't really matter. But yeah, doing the live thing is how I want to give my patrons some exclusivity, and then I always post the recording on YouTube, so don't worry about missing anything as I post all of them anyway. And now we're doing the little giveaway. So what I'm giving away is this custom book. It's one of its kind. It was made by me. It's a book that has some of my 4th era lore scripts in it, which are optimized for reading. This book is not available anywhere because, of course, there's copyright. It isn't for sale and it isn't for resale. It's just something cool that I made for myself, and I made one extra for a lucky fan. It has some of my 4th era scripts in this, as I said before, and it's made more readable by fixing the typos, those kind of things. And it's supplemented with artwork, maps and graphs. If you wish to win this thing, there's one thing you have to do. You need to go to the description of this video, find the link to the Google form that's there. And once there, you have to fill out your name, a name or place I can contact you in case that you won, because otherwise, well, you know, I can't contact you to have it shipped to you. Your favorite video of mine, your least favorite video of mine, and any general feedback that you may have on the video's direction of the channel or whatever. You don't have to fill anything into the last category unless you want to give some specific feedback, which I'm very happy of. Because giving this feedback with the favorite video and least favorite video, and of course the general feedback, I know what to improve in 2020 on the channel. And if you give me the feedback, you have a chance to win this little book. So the giveaway is unbiased, as I will just randomly select a name and then contact you myself for the book. In the contact section, it's more convenient for me if you either use email, Discord or Instagram, as those are the platforms that I use most. But if you don't have any of those, you can always do other things. Again, I'll randomly select, so if you use something else than those 3 things, it will just be harder for me, but you won't have less of a chance to win. On screens are my names for those platforms that I named, so that you can be fooled by any imposters or anything. And also any data you fill into the form will be handled with full anonymity. It won't be shared with anyone and will be deleted after the contest is over. Don't worry about privacy. So, with that said, I wish everybody who enters a lot of luck with the giveaway. And again, everybody a very Merry Christmas. Unfortunately, my Christmas special was not to be this year because of all the Christmas shenanigans. Fortunately, I still had the recording from the lore lectures, which I could now post. So, yeah, I wish everybody a very Merry Christmas, and I'll see you next Thursday. Bye-bye.